Great. Hello, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for today's OGP partner session on enabling civil society and development cooperation and humanitarian assistance. Just a brief note that as you just heard, we'll be recording today's session and we'll make the recording available after the event. My name is Nikhil Dutta. I'm a legal advisor at the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law. And I wanted to express our sincerest thanks to the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate and the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, or SIDA, for co-hosting this event with ICNL today. Thanks also to the OGP Support Unit for putting together this week's outstanding slate of events, and to our host, the Government of Korea, for bringing us together for this summit. Today, we'll be exploring a groundbreaking recent instrument from the OECD Development Assistance Committee, the DAC recommendation on enabling civil society and development cooperation and humanitarian assistance. The recommendation, as many of you know, is the first international standard setting out guidance for providers of development assistance on enabling civil society. As we'll see today, the recommendation does a lot more than provide guidance for DAC members or donors. The recommendation lays out a roadmap for providers and partners to enable civil society and development cooperation by promoting civic space, engaging with civil society, and incentivizing CSO effectiveness. The recommendation provides a powerful resource for OGP members to draw on in co-creating commitments to expand civic space and public participation, as our OGP co-chairs have called for this year. The OGP process also provides an excellent opportunity for governments to advance implementation of the recommendation. We have an action-packed agenda today and a number of incredible speakers. We'll start with a panel discussion to unpack the recommendation, its value to governments, and its relevance to OGP. Then we'll hear perspectives from some key government partners on the recommendation and enabling civil society and development cooperation. We'll then welcome the present and incoming civil society co-chairs of OGP, who will explore how the recommendation can support the development of OGP commitments to enable civil society. And then finally, we'll open it up for questions and a plenary discussion. So without further ado, let's turn to our panel. It is my great pleasure to introduce our panelists who bring a wealth of expertise regarding the recommendation and the OGP process. We have Jacqueline Wood, Team Lead and Senior Civil Society Specialist at the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate, Viveka Karlistam, Senior Policy Specialist for Civil Society at SIDA, and Tonu Basu, Deputy Director of Thematic Policy Areas at OGP. Jacqueline, let's start with you. The DCD played a really invaluable role in developing the recommendation. Could you tell us a little bit about what the recommendation is and what it does?
Certainly, it would be my pleasure to do so. And I'll just say, I'm told that my sound is a bit of an echo, and I apologize for that. I've tried to troubleshoot it, but not been able to resolve it. But I hope you can hear me all right. So thanks for this great opportunity. We very much appreciate being able to be here. Nikki has already said, mentioned that this new DAC recommendation is the first international standard for providers of development cooperation and humanitarian assistance to enable civil society as a contributor to the 2030 agenda and to inclusive development and to strengthening democracy. I want to mention a little bit, I want to talk a little bit about the recommendation in that it's an OECD legal instrument, and just to explain a bit, what does that mean? So an OECD legal instrument, it's soft law, so it's not legally binding, but still it represents a strong political commitment on the part of the adherents with great moral force that really represents the will of all the adherents. In this case, so far, the adherents are DAC members. And as a legal instrument of the OECD, it also comes with certain requirements for dissemination, for implementation, of course, by adherents, but also for implementation support by us at the Development Cooperation Directorate. And it also comes with requirements around monitoring. So these are requirements that come with the recommendation, but that wouldn't come with another kind of OECD sort of standards piece of work, like say a guidance or principles or something like that. So a recommendation is also, something that provides a common framework or standard for DAC members and for others that may wish to adhere to it. So Nikki's also mentioned that the recommendation addresses 3 interlinked pillars about how DAC members can better first respect, protect, and promote civic space. Secondly, how they can better support and engage with civil society. And thirdly, how they can incentivize CSO effectiveness and transparency and accountability. Now, you might be wondering why these three pillars. And the answer to that is that because in the evidence gathering that we did leading up to the recommendation, two of the key sources were a study on DAC members in civil society, and also we produced a foresight policy paper on digital transformation and the futures of civic space. And in that evidence gathering, along with other sources, there were two things that were clear. One, that there were sort of worrying trends of challenges that needed to be addressed in these three areas of the three pillars. But two, also that it was clear that these three challenges are very much interlinked. They affect each other, and so couldn't really be addressed in isolation from each other. And as an example of that, as a provider of development cooperation and humanitarian assistance, you might be concerned about shrinking civic space, and you might choose to take some actions to say, support institutions and capacities in a partner country to better protect civic space. But if you're not also at the same time paying attention to how you support and strengthen civil society in partner countries so that they themselves can defend civic space, and so that they can also have strong accountability relationships at local levels, then you're really only addressing a piece of the puzzle. Hence these three interlinked pillars of the DAC recommendation. And I'll leave it there for now, because I know there's other panelists that are going to have interesting things to share.
Thanks so much, Jacqueline. I think that's a very helpful sort of explanation, not only of what the recommendation is, but its rationale and the really important role of engaging civil society and enabling civil society to support development cooperation. Vivica, I'd like to turn to you next. Sweden was one of the leading countries pushing for adoption of an ambitious recommendation. From CEDA's perspective, why is the recommendation a valuable standard?
Thank you for inviting me to this to begin with. It's very interesting and fun to be here. To CEDA, the recommendation is very valuable as a standard because we agree that Agenda 2030 and the SDGs will not be achieved without the fundamental contributions from civil society. And we only have 8 years left with the odds against us until year 2030, and therefore definitely much more must be done, and it's urgent. And so for us as DAC members to enable civil society, particularly in partner countries or the so-called Global South, in a coherent way, interlinking the protection of civic space with our support and engagement with Global South CSOs, along with strengthening their own development effectiveness, transparency, and accountability. To achieve this, the recommendation is a very powerful tool. And we also warmly welcome the recommendation as it is a common framework and a shared political commitment, setting the spotlight on us as DAC members and donors, demanding of us that we scrutinize how we engage with civil society so that we make sure to change and improve policies and practices that today hamper CSO ability to contribute to the 2030 agenda. And this will be monitored and followed up, which is excellent. The recommendation also forces us to walk the talk when it comes to our international commitments to the development effectiveness agenda. You all remember Paris and Accra and Busan and so on, and how we have agreed to the 4 principles of local ownership, focus on results, inclusive partnerships, and transparency and accountability. I perceive it as the overall aim of the recommendation is precisely for us to better apply these principles and speed up our work. We have, as donors, unintentionally, I believe, in the past, sometimes even contributed to shrinking civic space with strict requirements of control and compliance at the cost of flexibility, trust, and impact. And we now have homework to do analyzing our own policies and practices, and power to change and improve so that civil society in the partner countries / global south, because I don't have a better word for it, can be supported as independent and trusted actors in their own right. The recommendation takes off from the OECD's study on DAC members and civil society that Jacqueline just mentioned from 2020, and other information and documentation too, of course, where several weaknesses were found along with significant gaps between policy and practice, including imbalances in power relations and funding flows between northern CSOs and southern CSOs. Therefore, redefining power and partnerships with civil society is something that SIDA, together with other actors, are currently addressing. The OECD study states, for instance, that 93% of all the DAC CSO funding goes to DAC country CSOs or INGOs, international CSOs or international NGOs, while 7% goes to CSOs in the partner countries. We believe that this is something that needs to change, and we think that the recommendation will assist us to improve these power and funding imbalances. I will finish there for now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Viveka. A lot of really sort of valuable points there about the importance of donor practices, especially doing no harm in the civic space, and also the urgency of empowering civil society if we are to achieve the 2030 agenda. Tonu, if I could turn to you next, civic space is a priority issue for OGP. Could you talk a little bit about how the recommendation aligns with OGP values?
Certainly, Nikhil, and thanks again to SIDA, OECD, and you for convening this important conversation on the back of this really flagship recommendation. And congratulations to everyone who was behind getting the recommendations passed, because things like these are very challenging to get to the finish line. So really congratulations to everyone involved here. I think there is a significant degree of overlap here, and I'd highlight sort of two specific things. One is, I think it is really important to see how the recommendation recognizes the role of civil society as independent actors in development assistance and cooperation, something my fellow panelists also highlighted. Now, one of the key foundational principles in OGP, as several of you know, is the importance of civil society having an equal seat at the policy table. And this is sort of enshrined in our co-creation process, in the way that civil society and governments have to work together to deliver OGP action plans. Now, the OGP declaration, or the Open Government Declaration that all OGP members commit to, emphasizes the importance of civic participation and civic space, including the respect for freedom of expression and association. So this is something all OGP members commit to, and it's great to see this enshrined in this recommendation as well. Now, OGP has completed 10 years this year, and one of the things that we have seen through data compiled and analyzed, looking back at the first decade, is that we have found that civil society engagement throughout the OGP process, so co-creation and implementation of commitments, is a strong predictor for ambitious commitments, rate of implementation, so a better rate of implementation, and rates of early results. So essentially, when civil society is involved, we see better results. And this is something, it's really good to see that the recommendation also sort of embeds in this, in the hope of seeing better results in the use of development assistance. And finally, I think touching on something that Viveka mentioned earlier, especially with regard to the localization agenda, this is extremely important for OGP, right? The action plan process is domestically owned. It is something that civil society in a country or in a local jurisdiction works on with that government. And I think the recommendation putting this sort of empowering local civil society to make these decisions from related to development assistance, I think is incredibly empowering. So that's, I think, one on the role of civil society. The second degree of really alignment and synergy with OGP and the recommendation is how the recommendation recognizes the threats of closing civic space and how it is a threat to the work of civil society, as well as the emphasis, on the other hand, of the importance of transparency and accountability, again, a foundational value of OGP. So I think it is, as we've seen over the last few years, we've seen civil society face increasing threats in doing their day-to-day work. And this is both in the global north and south, actually. And we've seen 15 consecutive years of democratic decline. And this is affecting the way that democracy democratic processes are undertaken, how development assistance is used in country, and then how this is monitored by civil society. And so I think, again, this being recognized in the recommendation is important, and this is something we see and work to improve day to day in OGP. Now, it requires a collaborative approach with government and civil society working together, and that's an important point of alignment between OGP values and recommendation. And finally, I think having 3 of our civil society co-chairs on this call really shows how seriously OGP leadership takes this issue. This year's co-chairs, Maria Baron and the government of South Korea, issued a call to action. Nicole, you mentioned that, for OGP governments to co-create ambitious commitments to expand civic space and public participation. And we hope that they can take on some of what is in the recommendation for their action plans. And it is really commendable to see OGP leadership, both on government and civil society, do that. We will be launching a civic space peer learning network later on this week at the summit. And we hope the network can really contribute to and amplify the recommendation further.
Thanks so much, Tonu. I really appreciate the simplicity of that point, that when civil society is empowered, we just see better results through the OGP process and also in development cooperation. If we could turn now to a bit of a lightning round, just quick responses from our panelists. Viveka, first from you. Could you talk very briefly about how the recommendation has had an influence on SIDA's policies and programs?
Yes. Even though the recommendation only has existed since July this summer, we are disseminating it everywhere and pushing for all embassies and strategies to implement it. We specifically underline 3 important tasks targeting civil society in partner countries and working with a human rights-based approach. 1 is support a pluralistic civil society as an objective in itself, in addition to supporting CSOs as independent development actors in their own right. And this also includes support and engagement with a wider range of civil society actors, such as grassroots, movements, informal actors, as well as support to partner country level civil society, their own think tanks, coalitions, alliances, and so on, so that they themselves can set the agenda and take the driver's seat. 2, more direct support and multi-year flexible and trust-based core support to partner countries' civil society actors, acknowledging the capacity and skills that they have. 3, much more dialogue and consultation with civil society at partner country level. And finally, I want to mention that the power and funding imbalances are now being addressed and debated in Sweden and SIDA. We need to make a power analysis of ourselves and our policies and practices. We talk about decolonizing civil society support. We analyze the assumptions we make and the language we use, etc., to remove all the obstacles to genuinely enable and strengthen local ownership and power in global South civil society. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Viveka. I think that sort of evidence of really concrete implementation already by SIDA shows how practically useful the recommendation can be. Jacqueline, turning to you next, could you talk a little bit about the next steps OECD is planning to advance implementation of the recommendation?
Certainly, I'd be happy to. If you allow me, I just want to do a little follow-up on what Tonu said, a couple of points. First of all, this idea of an OGP network on civic space, I don't know if there's opportunities for others like such as ourselves to follow that. We'd be very happy to, but also just to affirm, this idea or key OGP principle about the importance of civil society having equal seat at the policy table, within the 3 pillars of the recommendation, participation of civil society appears multiple places. So we're really on the same page there about that, as well as the fact that, of course, the recommendation in and of itself sort of embodies that belief. So next steps. Thank you for indulging me there for a moment. So yes, we have quite a big agenda. Next steps, because the adoption of the recommendation was, of course, a huge milestone, but it's only the starting point, of the change process. And Sweden is here already taking has some big plans and next steps ahead, but we need also all of the adherents to come along as well to translate the commitments of the recommendation into policies and practices. So we've got 3 main objectives going forward that are being pursued with leadership from something we call the DAC Community of Practice on Civil Society, which is made up of DAC member representatives from headquarters that work with and on civil society issues. So Vivica is one example of a participant in that community of practice, but also we will be engaging with CSOs from the DAC CSO reference group, which is a platform of CSOs that I'm not sure we may be hearing from today. So of the 3 objectives, the first one is dissemination of the recommendation. And the idea is, of course, to sustain momentum among DAC members, but also to expand the number of adherents to the recommendation, because right now it has 30 DAC member adherents, but other providers of development cooperation and humanitarian assistance that are not DAC members can also adhere to this recommendation. And that includes countries that are or are not OECD members. Also, intergovernmental organizations can adhere. So expanded adherence is something that we're quite keen on, the DAC is quite keen on. It is a way for the recommendation to have more and more global reach. And there are, the adherence process is fairly easy, maybe I shouldn't say easy, but it's a simple 3-step process of adherence. And I welcome there any interested governments or intergovernmental institutions participating today. If they would like to reach out bilaterally, we can share more on that process with you. And of course, I should also note that CSOs themselves cannot formally adhere to an OECD recommendation, but they can do what in OECD legal terms is called follow it or endorse it. But even regardless of following or endorsing, in particular the 3rd pillar of the recommendation, though not exclusively the 3rd pillar, signals that CSOs could also take some actions to implement the recommendation. So 2 more objectives. The second objective is to support adherence to implement the recommendation by what we'll be doing is, facilitating learning, exchanges that build an understanding of what the recommendation means for adherence in practice. And also we're going to be developing toolkits on some of, well, eventually perhaps all of the provisions, but in an iterative way, developing toolkits to support adherence with the implementation. And the 3rd objective is monitoring progress of the recommendations implementation. And for the most part, we'll be trying to leverage existing data and processes to gather information on adherence experiences, their progress, their lessons. In particular, we're going to be relying on the DAC peer reviews of DAC members that happen every 5 years. And we are looking forward to working with our colleagues at DCD who are responsible for those peer reviews. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much again.
Thanks so much, Jacqueline. I think that's a really valuable point to note, that the adoption of the recommendation is just the starting point now of work to implement the recommendation. And in particular, I think there really is scope through the OGP process to considering entering into commitments to both adhere to and implement the recommendation, which I think we're going to hear a little more about. Tonu, finally turning to you, could you talk a little bit about how the recommendation can fit into OGP co-creation and action plans?
Certainly, Nikhil, and just a quick word to Jacqueline. I mean, we're very happy to collaborate. We work very closely with the Open Government Unit and the Civic Space Observatory on one hand, and I think the DAC recommendation provides a strong complement to this work and really well-rounded approach to civic space. So we'll be really glad to cooperate with you on implementation of these recommendations. Nikhil, to your question, I think just very quickly, I want to touch on 3 points. One is, I think, we know that OGP action plans have been used in the past as a vehicle to deliver on and implement recommendations by multilateral bodies. We've seen that happen, for instance, including for open government recommendations made by the OGP to various countries. And we certainly encourage OGP governments and civil society to engage through the co-creation process and develop commitments to implement the recommendations principles. And I hope we can hear some ideas from speakers later on. Second, we've seen some OGP governments already, be ahead of the curve on this, including Denmark, France, Germany, and Sweden, in fact, and who've entered into commitments to bolster transparency and participation in their development programs. This is really scratching the surface, so we hope we can see more, especially see commitments on inclusive consultation with civil society, how to involve local civil society in the development of development strategies, and implementation of the recommendations principles. And finally, OGP, the co-creation process in OGP is governed by what we call participation and co-creation standards. And this has sort of been developed over the last 10 years and really governs how civil society and governments dialogue with each other at the OGP table. And this could really draw on the recommendations principles, but again, hopefully contribute to how these principles are further implemented in OGP countries through OGP processes and action plans.
That's such a great point, Tanu, that there really is synergy between OGP and this OECD recommendation and the possibility for learning in both directions, I think. So thanks so much to all of you. That was incredibly helpful in unpacking the recommendation and fits within the OGP framework. Of course, the recommendation builds on years of best practices by leading governments to enable civil society in development cooperation. I'd like to give the floor now to a few of these governments to hear their perspectives on the recommendation and their experiences with empowering and engaging civil society in development activities. So I'd like to begin by inviting a few remarks from Susan Paravertsoff, the Director of the Global Citizens and Engagement Division at Global Affairs Canada. Susan, we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. I hope everyone can hear me all right. Yeah, and thanks very much for this opportunity. It's always so enriching to hear from others how they're tackling, frankly, common concerns and common objectives that we have, including how better to enable civil society. So I'd like to share a little bit about how Canada partners with civil society and some of the experiences that we've had with a civil society partnership policy that we have. At the core of our approach to developing international assistance is partnering with a range of actors, a range of organizations, civil society, foundations, of course, the multilateral agencies, private sector, and universities and colleges, a very wide and diverse range of partners. And with civil society especially, I think it's based on this recognition that they're actors in their own right, and they bring their own and very long list of valuable attributes and capacities to the process of delivering international assistance. I mean, they have experience and expertise. Of course, they have a unique and intimate knowledge often of local challenges and opportunities, and they can mobilize voices of the poorest and the most vulnerable and the most marginalized in a way that is critical to effectively implementing in Canada, for instance, the feminist international assistance policy. And so that's a long-standing process that we have, and we continue to engage with other countries to share these best practices and examples of how best to do this. Canada is currently chairing the Community of Democracies Working Group on enabling and protecting civil society. So the role that civil society has in the implementation of international assistance is in some ways facilitated or mediated by the branch that I work in within our organization. An entire branch has been set up for partnerships for development innovations, and we play a key role in facilitating relationships or managing the links with the Canadian organizations. Global Affairs Canada channeled over $1 billion to Canadian organizations for the delivery of international assistance last year. So this approach has been captured under a Canadian policy for civil society partnerships that was developed in 2015, and then it was updated once we had our Feminist International Assistance Policy, and it seeks to to build this. It seeks to support Canadian, international, and local CSOs working in partnership to develop innovative solutions and to deliver on SDGs and on the Feminist International Assistance Policy. So it is based on a human rights-based approach, as is our Feminist International Assistance Policy, as well as the Istanbul Principles for CSO Development Effectiveness. But the policy, we don't stop at just the policy. In fact, what gives it the most power, I would say, is that there was a jointly really a co-drafting process that was embarked upon that good year and a half to 2 years to develop a policy implementation plan. And it's one of the few policies I've seen that has such a robust implementation plan, honestly. But it captures these mutual priorities and commitments from both government and civil society. And it lists commitments as well as actual concrete, actions and activities and milestones. And on a range of issues. So there are nine objectives that are captured in this implementation plan that range from promoting civil society, fostering innovation, engaging Canadians, nurturing multi-stakeholder partnerships, facilitating a safe and enabling environment for civil society, and then I mentioned before, integrating the role of civil society organizations as independent actors into international assistance policy. And that's often through dialogue, but also promoting more flexible, equitable, and predictable, transparent funding mechanisms. So this is, it's quite a detailed implementation plan, I would say, but it helps to guide the work of the department, not just in this branch that I work in, but in many other parts of the department, whether they're working on policy or process issues or specific thematics. But these, the implementation is taking time, honestly, a lot of time and a lot of concerted effort. In some cases, there are specific dialogue forums that are established to look at these issues in detail. In other cases, they sort of filter into different processes that we have in place. But in order to ensure that we're actually progressing, we've embarked on a formal stock take exercise with high-level narrative reporting that will be able to, that not just allows the department and our civil society partners to look at where we are making progress, but to remind ourselves and ensure that we're progressing along the path and to integrate some lessons learned. It also provides an opportunity to look at what the challenges have been and to look forward and to help guide us as we move forward on this implementation. So a couple of examples that have come out, frankly, from this process that are very concrete are, for example, support to the Canadian civil society organizations on preventing sexual exploitation and abuse. So a center of excellence was set up called DIGNA that allows our civil society partners to strengthen their capacity and to meet a capacity gap that they have identified on that. And we have also larger, more flagship initiatives that support civil society, particularly in our developing country partner partners related to gender equality and related to women's rights organizations. They're very good examples of close engagement with civil society through innovative mechanisms that provide flexible and predictable funding. So I think that these tools and these initiatives that we have, set us in a good place to continue work in line with the DAC recommendation on enabling civil society. Canada fully endorsed the recommendation. It's a very important instrument to help mobilize our efforts and our commitment at all levels to respecting, protecting, and promoting civic space, to supporting and engaging with civil society, and incentivizing CSO effectiveness. So we look forward to continuing working with some of the partners around the table today, as Jacqueline and others at the OECD DAC, community of practice on enabling civil society. So yeah, very much look forward to the next steps on this. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Susan. Really impressive array of engagement by Canada and real deep engagement with civil society and revising your policies, which I think is a possible OGP commitment as well. The government they want to consider revising their development policies in collaboration with civil society to reflect the recommendations principles. Now I'd like to offer the floor to Marianne Vestergaard, team leader of the Civil Society, Human Rights and Democracy team at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark. Thanks so much for joining us today, Marianne. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. And sorry, I just have to get my very low-tech solution in order because we don't use Zoom in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Denmark. So I'm on my phone and I'm placing the phone in a cup. So I'm just going to have to sit still to not rock the boat too much. But thanks, Nikhil, for giving me the word and for sparking this very important discussion. I think, as has been said by previous speakers and colleagues, the DAC recommendation and the endorsement in July is a big step towards committing OECD members to work together and to enable civic space and towards more effective support to and through civil society. So the recommendation is a very important common supporting framework, and it gives us sort of the lever to also provide political commitments and see where we can take the recommendation and make it a living document and take it into our policies and practices. I can't take any credit for it, but I know that my predecessor Thomas was very much involved in the formulation and the preparations of the recommendations. So in that sense, I'm happy to see the recommendations very much is a one-to-one fit with the way we think and do in terms of enabling civic space in Denmark with our partners in the Global South. Also in the summer, we have a newly approved development cooperation strategy here in Denmark, the result of a long negotiation process at the political level. And this development cooperation strategy places democracy and human rights as the foundation of all our work. And it emphasizes the vital role of civil society in fostering democratic societies. And the work of preparing the recommendations and the recommendation and the dialogue that went ahead was part of the inputs that we provided to the formulation of this strategy. And it's also reflected in our Denmark for Civic Space priority area that we have put a lot of emphasis on here in the ministry, focusing on support to human rights defenders, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, free media, and civil society's digital resilience. And the last point is further unfolded in what we've newly launched is our Tech for Democracy initiative that aims to promote democracy in an era of digitalization. And that has a very strong focus on strengthening civic space and digital resilience of civil society. It also has a range of other core elements that has to do with bringing the tech industry and tech companies in the room to discuss solutions to how we can overcome some of the threats to democracy that is fostered by technological development, but using also tech for democracy and not only against. So historically, we have Denmark have a strong tradition for close support to civil society. Approximately 7% of our total ODA goes to civil society. And we provide multi-year flexible partnerships, and we have moved away from project funding for our strategic CSO partners. And this gives an important predictability and also multiplier effects for our CSO partners. But there's certainly also room for improvement for Denmark. We're still not there yet in terms of engaging directly with civil society, and both my Canadian and Swedish colleagues have already alluded to this. The direct support to civil society actors in the Global South, despite having ambitious targets in our new strategic partnerships with Danish CSOs on local leadership, and pushing our partners, which are Danish NGOs, to demonstrate results on local leadership. We've set up 5 dimensions that they have to report progress towards. So we've sort of moved away from only looking at financial transfers to Southern-based CSOs, because our analysis was that it limits the focus on only financial resources. We want to look at all the dimensions of local leadership. But we still have very little direct support to CSOs in the Global South. And I mean, Viveka has already alluded to the percentages, the 93.7, and it is, I think, something that we as a donor community need to take seriously and work together to overcome, because it's not good enough. So we want to use going forward the recommendation as a lever and as a tool to be better at the direct support to CSO in the Global South. We want to be much better at talking to our Danish partners on demonstrating their value added and their support to local partners, and also being much better at engaging directly also in policy discussions with CSOs in the Global South. And I can talk much more about this, but I'll leave it for now, also allowing other colleagues to get on board. But thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Marianne. And again, I think those are 2 outstanding potential OGP commitments. 1, to increase direct support to CSOs in the Global South, and 2nd, to engage CSOs in consultations around the development priorities and strategies. Turning now to Philip Tigo, Senior Advisor on Data Innovation and Open Government at the Office of the Presidency of the Government of Kenya. We would so much appreciate your views, Philip.
Thank you so much. I think I'll take a slightly different approach because we are not a donor country. A couple of things. One, I think for us, we kind of had a cheat sheet for this. Our constitution requires that all laws, decisions, and policies must engage citizens. When this administration came in 2013, we believed and still believe that civil society remains a channel outside parliament, that citizens can amplify their voices and hold government to account, and all governments. The third piece is that early in 2015, and this is when we were re-engaging in OGP, His Excellency the President and the Deputy President stated actually in public, and this is written, that the development challenge at this time is no longer the preserve of government, that the SDGs really requires everybody. And so, and I'll quote, we recognize that if Kenya is to move ahead, we must deliberately pursue collaboration, that government, civil society, and academia must work together. It is no longer an issue of political will, but a matter of rational economic and political choice. So this is something that we had early in the year. And so from then on in 2015, we basically adopted a multi-stakeholder collaborative approach in everything that we do. So for those of us those of you who've seen Kenya lead, whether globally or locally, through the Global Partnership on Sustainable Development Data, Digital Earth Africa, recently the Innovation Week, we simply adopt that approach. Going specifically to open government, because that gives us a very specific platform that is co-created in a way that engages citizens and civil society alike. We have a permanent dialogue mechanism, as Tono had mentioned. We've gone beyond the sort of engagement to say, listen, can civil society co-chair the local steering committee, the technical working groups, the clusters. So civil society and government are the same. These are 3 lessons, and I'll be very quick. One is it's about people. And what we've seen, and I've been fortunate to have been there since this administration started, is building trust. We can have all the best articles or papers, but if you do not build trust, then that's a problem. You have to be accessible and you have to be responsive. And the other piece we've seen is that we have to be in the trenches with civil society. There's no divide. And to the extent that if there's a problem in governance, then some of us must step up with civil society, use our political will and engagement, even to open up very quiet tables for civil society to engage outside the camera. The second piece, of course, is process and power. This is where these partnerships are actually articulated. And so governments, in our case, must cede ground in most cases. engage civil society, include them in processes where power is curated. The third piece is praxis, and it's really about practical ideations. We co-fundraise with civil society. We bring them in all meetings we have with funders. They come with us everywhere, including Senate and Parliament engagement. We have a unified channel. In Kenya, WhatsApp is our channel, so we have a unified channel of WhatsApp to engage. But I think it's about inclusion. So how you practice for us is about inclusion. Have good policies, have good frameworks, but then it's about doing. I'll end there.
Thanks so much for that, Philip. It's really impressive the way the government of Kenya has been able to integrate that multi-stakeholder approach throughout its development program. And also appreciate your remarks, which I think really demonstrate the relevance of the recommendation, not just to DAC members and not just to donors, but to partners and civil society actors that are engaged in development cooperation. So thanks so much to Susan, Marianne, and Philip for those interventions, which were, I think, really helpful in illustrating how leading governments are already working to enable civil society in their development cooperation programs. The core of OGP, of course, is the co-creation and action plan process. And we're very fortunate to welcome now the current and incoming civil society co-chairs of OGP to discuss a little more how the recommendation can translate into effective OGP commitments. I'll turn first to Maria Barón, Executive Director of Directorio Legislativo. Maria is the current and outgoing civil society chair of OGP, and I really did want to take this chance to offer our heartiest thanks to Maria for her really impactful and successful tenure as OGP co-chair. Maria, the first pillar of the recommendation focuses on respecting, protecting, and promoting civic space. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how this pillar can translate into OGP commitments.
Thank you very much, Nikhil, and thank you very much to ICNL, CEDA, and OECD for the invitation to speak today and share some reflections. I think I was secretly wishing for this document or something like this to come out and to be published, because it's a really big and important help from the muscle that civil society is putting. And I think it relates to what we talk a lot in OGP, which is connecting all of the conversations. So the international and governmental organization, and also all the way down to the local and more grassroots conversation to make sense of what everything, all of these initiatives is doing. And I think this will bring a lot of commitments from the different governments, and it shows a lot of leadership from the governments that are already in DAC. So I chose to briefly go into what I want to reflect on. I chose 3 of the paragraphs that are in the recommendations in Pillar 1. The first one is the one that talks about developing clear policy positions on civic space and of independent civil society. And the second one is seeking to engage in dialogue. And the third one, supporting and engaging with regional and independent bodies. And I think there's a lot behind those words that we can reflect on here in this 3 minutes that we have. I think that the 3 sort of concepts that come out in those, for me at least, is the first one, of course, transparency and accountability, which is the value and spirit of OGP. The second one is dialogue, which we talk less, but it's really, really relevant, and it's very enshrined in the co-creation process. And the third one, which is a concept we don't talk too much, but it's also implied, it's the issue of clarity, that I want to stop there too. But in those sort of 3 pillars, 3 sort of recommendations, I want to maybe share a line or 2 in each. The first one is about what those imply. I think there's a lot behind the scenes, a lot of assumptions in the issue of the clarity of the process and the including of civil society, I think, in the policy positions. And I think there's a lot of, like I said, assumptions that need to be worked in the different countries or in the different governments. The first one is the open decision making, which we always talk about in OGP, and it's not a guarantee in any of the countries of the global south or of the global north. The second, and you can imply there open parliament as well, and it implies co-creation, participation, and especially, of course, access to public information. The second one is the dialogue, and it's for us, from our civil society perspective, dialogue is when you lose the dialogue or we start losing the dialogue, it's the first red flag to then after that losing a lot of other things. So I think it's really, really relevant that you put it in the recommendations. The third one is the issue, like I was saying earlier, the issue about clarity. Many governments, more so this year than before, are redefining the different concepts. So what is civic space? It's not the same for everyone. It's not the same for all the governments today, and it's not the same for each government in the same country. So I think the clarity there is really, really relevant, especially if you're going to have clarity of a specific position. Also, who are civil society is not the same concept. What is civil society organizations or not in the different countries? I think there's really an issue there as well. What is co-creation as well? Although OGP has all the guidelines and all the concepts clear, I think it's really relevant that the OECD brings clarity into that, and also especially how to measure all these, how to measure the commitments, how to measure the different policies that are going to be regulated or passed in the different countries. And then lastly, because there are a lot of gray areas there, I think, and it's really relevant to put black and white. And the third one is something that I said at the beginning, and with this I'm closing because Nikhil asked me to shorten it a little bit, and it's the issue about connecting the dots of the different conversations to make sense of all this that we're talking here at the international level, and to the people that are at the grassroots or at the national level. To not we talk about this a lot with OGP, and I think within OGP, and I think this will be a great help to not lose touch with from those groups or people or communities that are in our different countries with the different international conversations, and also not to lose the bar with the communities that are out there, and usually international beneficial ownership, whatever you want. So to try to connect the different groups and conversations at the local level to those. And I think this document will help a lot in that. Just that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maria, and also for emphasizing the importance of connecting the dots, not only from the international level all the way down to the grassroots level, but also in developing commitments in this area, the need to have an interagency approach and to work with partners in government from a variety of different ministries and agencies to try to develop commitments in this area. I apologize for noting that we are running a little behind, and unfortunately we'll have to cut short our plenary discussion. I think this is thanks to the rich discussion we've had. We would encourage participants, if you have questions, to post them in the chat, and then we can seek to get back to you on any of those questions that you might have about the recommendation or implementation. Next, I'd like to give the floor to Aiden Eyakuze, the Executive Director of Huawei East Africa. Aiden will be assuming the civil society co-chairship of OGP in just under a week, and really looking forward to his leadership. Aiden, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the second pillar of the recommendation regarding supporting and engaging with civil society and how that might translate into OGP commitments.
Hello, I was on mute. Thank you, Nikhil. I wasted a few seconds there. Thank you so much for this invitation as well. And it's great hearing from everybody on this recommendation, which I read with a great deal of interest. And I want to just start by quoting, because I appreciated so much what they both said, Viveka about decolonizing DAC. I think it's very relevant to pillar 2. And Philip, it's about doing. And so I want to really reflect on the second pillar with those two things in mind. First of all, supporting and engaging with civil society is actually a sine qua non in the OGP. It's part of the Open Government Declaration that you protect the ability of civil society organizations to operate in ways consistent with the commitment to freedom of expression, association, and opinion. It's a non-negotiable, so it's fantastic that it's there as part of the DAC recommendations. So how do these show up in the commitments? And what I want to do very quickly is share what I thought of as some philosophical flavors for donor engagement with civil society that I harvested in reading Pillar 2, and really two elements of that pillar, number 1 and number 3. And the philosophical flavors are as follows. First of all, embedded in the recommendation is intentionality. And the first one talks about, number 1, it talks about having a clear, articulate objectives for working with diverse range of civil society actors. And so it's great that the intentionality is articulated in there. And fantastically, the OGP Steering Committee last month endorsed a new updated participation and co-creation standards, which I think gives life to this intentionality. There is space as standard number 1. You've got to create the space. You've got to be open to civil society participation, to be inclusive, and therefore bring the diversity. You've got to be responsive, respond to the questions and queries that are raised, and then have it as a sustained policy. I think so. The first one, intentionality. The second one, which I really liked, was the notion of equality. That's the best word I could use here. A recognition that civil society actors are independent development and humanitarian actors in their own right, which means that there is a recognition that they have a great deal of agency. So what this suggests is that for donors, DAC partners, it means resisting the instinct to instrumentalize them as mere implementing partners. So it also means that you have to have a significant degree of flexibility in the form and in the style of engagement with the civil society that reflects a good understanding of the context in which they're in, the risks that are there, and the opportunities that are there. Being a civil society person myself with an institution, I know sometimes it can be quite a struggle that we're being asked to fit in one sort of funding or one sort of reporting mechanism, which may not fit with what it is that we're trying to do. The third thing is that flexibility requires humility. And this might be a little challenging or a little strange, but humility meaning the desire and the ability to truly listen and learn from local experience of civil society. Now, global practice or best practices might have to be adjusted in order to respond to local circumstances, if they are to have any chance of making a positive difference. In fact, you could get the paradox here that efficiency could well be the enemy of effectiveness. Being efficient might not make you effective in sort of achieving the change that you're looking for. And then there is the matter of trust. Trust in the intentions and the capacity of civil society on the part of DAC. Now, one can approach civil society as investors and say, hey, let's co-create, let's take some risks together and see if we can solve a public problem. The alternative could be you come in as inspectors. We are here to examine how you do your work, and if you pass, you get funding. If you don't, sorry, we move on to the next one, right? So the trust and building that trust is really very important. The second paragraph that I really liked was the third one, number 3, which speaks of the availability of flexible, predictable, programmatic, as opposed to sort of project-based support. And I've got to admit here that this on the side of DAC probably requires a lot of imagination and quite a bit of courage. So I want to insert into this conversation a conversation that I've been a part of in the private philanthropy space and see if there's some lessons or some ideas that can be drawn. A few US-based foundations and donor advisors are actually exploring how to do what they call serious systems change philanthropy. And opening up government, I think, qualifies as systems change. And I'm going to put a link to this article.
Aidan, I'm so sorry to note that we are just coming up on the end of our allotted time. If it would be possible to wrap up so we can move to Annabelle very quickly before concluding the session. Thank you so much.
Sure. I think the most important thing in terms of really doing systems change philanthropy is to be bold, to imagine something bold, how we're going to work with civil society organizations, and then to institutionalize it, which means reflecting internally as DAC partners how we're actually going to operate in an effective manner with civil society organizations. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that, Aidan, and for that really important emphasis on empowering civil society as an independent development actor. Now I'd like to turn, so we are about at the end of our allotted time. It's possible for folks to stay on for just a few minutes longer. I would like to offer the floor to Annabelle Cruz, the founder director of the Communication and Development Institute of Uruguay. Annabelle's recently been elected as the Civil Society co-chair of OGP, who will take over in mid-2022. And Annabelle, we'd love to hear your thoughts on the third pillar of the recommendation, incentivizing CSO effectiveness, and how that might relate to OGP commitments. Thanks again, if folks can stay on for just a few minutes longer.
Thank you. Thank you, Nikhil. I think I have some 30 seconds for the third pillar, so I will try to be brief. Thank you so much for the opportunity of this conversation. Thank you for organizing this session. And the area, the third pillar, focused on promoting civil society effectiveness, transparency, and accountability. The three pillars are very much interconnected. And I think the whole recommendation is a shared belief about the importance of a strong, independent, accountable, and diverse civil society. And this is valid both in donor countries, in the partner countries, in the global south, to which development cooperation flows. And in this context, accountability is not an end in itself. It has to be also a way to strengthen our organizations, to protect organizations in a shrinking civic space, and of course, to generate legitimacy. All provisions in these third pillars are very relevant, and some provisions really speak to the necessary power shift in international cooperation. Let me mention in this 30 seconds just two calls for action that I think are very important. The first provision, let me tell you this, not about external sophisticated certification processes or quality seals. It is not about fear of CSO corruption. It is about to build system of trust, because it talks about to build on existing good practice and standards in civil society-led regulation, transparency, and accountability mechanisms. Furthermore, another provision is clear about that civil society needs support to implement mutual capacity building action to address and reinforce the resilience, accountability, and effectiveness. I am really delighted to hear from Viveka and Jacqueline about the need to go direct to the global south to support civil society organization in these efforts. So some concrete actions that I think can link the recommendation and OGP. On the first hand, I think CSO transparency and accountability should be a transversal component of all OGP commitments, national plan, local plan, that include civil society and citizen participation. Because it's not only, there are national plans, but we have also many dozens of local jurisdictions that it's very important in terms of also of this recommendation. The second point, the multi-stakeholder forums in OGP processes can work on improving the effectiveness, transparency, and accountability of participating civil society organizations. There are room for improvement in these multi-stakeholder forums, and practicing what we preach is a step forward in the road to improving and strengthening civil society. And number three, in terms of existing good practices, let me mention the global standard for CSO accountability, which is indeed mentioned in this recommendation as well. It's a reference standard that talks about, it's an existing good practice and self-regulation practice that civil society organizations from all the world have created and developed together to strengthen their accountability practices. CSO should receive support to improve these ongoing self-regulation processes. donors, decision makers in the North and also in the South should pay attention to this kind of mechanism as the global standard or other CSO-led mechanisms. Really delighted also to have heard from Vivek and Jacqueline about the implementation, about the need of dissemination of this recommendation. It not only should be a paper approved, but we need to promote its implementation, support lesson learned, adaptation, and sharing best practices to build understanding and capabilities. Thank you so much again for this short but excellent discussion.
Thanks so much, Annabelle, and thank you for really emphasizing the point that the multi-stakeholder fora can draw on these principles as well in trying to empower civil society, bolster the capacity of civil society to effectively engage in co-creation, which I think is a very important point. So we have run over. Thanks so much to all of our speakers and panelists, and especially to the OECD Development Cooperation Directorate and CEDA, our co-organizers. And thanks so much to the participants, especially for staying on past the allotted time. We really do look forward to continuing to work with you on implementing the recommendation and supporting civil society and development cooperation. So thanks so much to all of you. We'll take a look at the questions that were included in the chat and we'll get back to you. And many thanks and good luck at this week's OGP Summit. Take care.